in those opening scenes for high school to be very vibrant, for the life, the constraints, the stresses, the joys of being a teenager, that teenage angst. We want to see that come through in your opening. So your opening, your act one, is really devoted to sucking your audience into your story, sucking them into the time and space of your story. If your film's taking place in the South in the 1860s, you want to very quickly establish for the audience, bring them in, suck them into a place that's very different from their own. This would be a place that in America that has segregation that's going on, and that would be very odd for us to see today. But the moment you're in that film, all of a sudden it's like you've time traveled. You want your film to be so complete, detailed, and feel so real that your audience loses themselves. Remember, we talked about that to really have a strong narrative, you want to put your audience in the time and the space of the character and make the story real for them. So you're going to spend a lot of focus in Act 1 on setting up your setting, making the people real, making the setting real. And that has to do with dialogue. You want your characters to really speak in the way that is natural and authentic for whatever setting and time and space you're in. For wherever you are geographically. That's also, and that actually, in America, we have a few misunderstandings of how one particular character speaks versus another person speaking. It's really driven by geography. And the rest of the world, they see that more often because you have France and you have Spain that are right next to each other. France is the surface area or is similar amount of space that we can compare to Texas. So as we move from state to state, they're moving from country to country. So they're more aware of of how geography really affects how people speak. We have the same thing in our country. If you're in New York, you speak differently from someone who speaks in Georgia. And that even goes across, the illusion of race. Someone might imagine that, if there's an Asian American person in New York, he's going to speak the same as an Asian American person in the South. And that's just not the case. He's going to speak the way his community of people speak in the North. And he's going to, and someone in the South will then take on those, colloquialisms and speech patterns and intonations. So we want to be aware of that. We want to be cognizant of that. Even here in Cleveland, there is a difference between the way Clevelanders talk and between the way people in Chicago speak or people in Pittsburgh. A lot of people outside of this area may think, well, that's all kind of similar. That's beginning to move from the East to the Midwest, so wouldn't they speak the same? As you guys know, no, not the case. You have different speech patterns and languages. As a writer, we become aware of that. As Aristotle says, we're imitating action, we're imitating life. So we're imitating the world we see around us. Our dialogue, we should have what writers will call an ear. An ear for dialogue. We hear the dialogue around us and then we're able to imitate it in our characters. So that's a large way that you're going to establish setting. We're also going to establish setting by describing the world. What's the feel of the world? What's the color of the world? What's the touch and taste of the world? These are what we call concrete language. Concrete language are words that describe senses. How does something look? How does something sound? How does it smell? How does it taste? And what does it feel like? What is it to actually touch it, tactile? Emotional, internal feelings are abstract language. What a character thinks and what a character feels. They're sad, they're happy, they're ecstatic, they're nervous. Those are abstract language. It's internal. Abstract language does not help us very much in dramatic writing. Dramatic writing is about tactile. Dramatic writing is about action. So even if your words, even if you have a character, as we said, action doesn't necessarily mean two people walking, fighting, interacting. I can tell you a story that's action oriented, or I can tell you a story that seems to be absent of action. I can also tell you a story that's tangible. I can tell you a story that talks about the way something tastes, the way something smells, the way it feels, the way it sounds. I can tell you those things, and now I'm being tactile. Even with my words, I'm being tactile. I'm being concrete. If I use my words to simply tell you how someone thinks on the inside and feels on the inside, that particular piece of writing is missing of action. It's missing of anything that someone can take on and play. So that's what we want to think of when we think of dramatic, is it's action, it's play. You can see the relation of these words. So if I tell you something, you can't play it, you can't act it out, you can't do it in charades, then it's not dramatic. When you begin to think, how do I make it charades? How do I take a character who's sad and then physically show you he's sad? How would I do that in charades? The moment you begin doing that is the moment you begin being a screenwriter. A screenwriter and actors both share the task of making the abstract physical. Making the abstract physical. So taking sadness, taking happiness, abstract, and making that physical. Smiling or crying. So in a screenplay, in your act one, you're going to establish your character physically. You're not going to say, I have a sad, melancholy character. You're going to say, a character slumps and slouches as he gets up in the morning. He sighs deeply. That's physical. We can now see. We can hear the sigh. We can even feel the weight of his slumping. So you want to do that throughout your entire work. Your own, you want to be doing it from the moment you come out of the gate in Act 1. Establish your setting, establish the way your characters speak, and the period, the space and the place and the time, and then establish your character, which is what we're starting to move into now. Establishing that your character isn't just sad, but physically showing that he is sad. Again, creative writing, show, don't tell. So don't tell me he's sad. Don't use the words, he is sad in the screenplay. Show me he's sad. He sighs, he slumps, he cries, show me. So that's something you're going to do throughout. You're going to really have to do it coming out of the gate. You also want to develop your character. So the time that we're going to get to know your character is in Act 1. We need to know her strengths and her flaws. It's very important that we develop flawed characters. Without flawed characters, they seem to lack a sense of authenticity. They seem to not be real to us because, as we see every day, human beings are flawed. We want to see their flaws. The flaw that your character has, what we call, can sometimes be a tragic flaw. A tragic flaw means that this is going to directly affect what happens to this character and the choices and decisions the character makes throughout the story. It means your story is custom tailored to that character, that it seems as though this story couldn't happen to anybody else but that character. You want to include that in your film because we feel like life is like that. Again, we're imitating life. Each human being, a human being can get into a car accident and go, of course this would happen to me. Of course this would happen to me on the day that I'm going in for my big interview, right before I'm nearly evicted from my apartment. Of course, for me of all days, I get in a car accident and miss my interview. We feel that that's us. We feel that we're the ones that it's happened to and that it hasn't happened to anyone else and that it will never happen to anyone else because there's something about us that made this happen. You want to bring that into your story. Your story should feel as though it can only happen to that particular person. So you want it to be tailor-made to their flaw. Really basic conventional examples that we would have to develop more so that they're less obvious if we were to really create a story around this, but it allows us to, kind of looking at some of these obvious examples allows us to understand the process. If you set up a character that has a fear of swimming, that character's call to action is going to be to get on a boat and go save his best friend. It's tailor-made. It seems as though his very flaw, his fear of swimming, is exactly what he's going to have to confront at the call to action. If you have and so you want it to be specific. You have a character that's afraid of people. His call to action is that he is going to have to lead 40 people through a march through the middle of town. The last thing that character feels that they're capable of doing is the very thing that your call to action calls them to do. And that specifically we call a tragic flaw because that's specifically happening in a tragedy. We'll talk in another lecture about the difference between the classical understanding of tragedy and the classical understanding of comedy. But creating a flaw in which your character directly is called to be challenged on that flaw, to overcome that flaw, and the call to action is a dramatic flaw. Another thing that may happen with a call to action is it may not necessarily be linked to a flaw. Your character should be flawed, but your character may have flaws that are not tragic flaws. This means that this flaw doesn't seem to be something that they need to surmount in their life, that they need to overcome. So you may have, for example, Woody Allen characters, oftentimes he writes a main character that's neurotic. In some of his work, it does become a tragic flaw, but in most of his work, it's not a tragic flaw. It's a characteristic, it's a part of that person, but their call to action actually has to do, and many times with Woody Allen's character, their call to action actually has to do with love. He usually has a romantic storyline, so his call to action is that they find the girl that they're in love with. Will they or won't they get together? So your call to action is a question for your character. Once you've developed your character, we know who she is, we know what her flaws are, we know whether it's a tragic flaw or whether it's a comedic flaw, in which the comedic flaw means the story doesn't necessarily hinge around challenging or changing that particular aspect of the person, whereas the tragedy does hinge around changing that part of the particular person, you have then your call to action. We do not really attach to characters that we don't know very well that then come up against a call to action. If we don't feel that we know the character, or we care about the character, or that the character is very well developed and that we see their strengths and we see their weaknesses, when they're called to do something, the audience doesn't seem as invested. So you have the majority of your act one really is establishing your character, letting us know who he or she is, so that the moment of the call to action, we care about them. Again, the call to action is what thrusts them into the dramatic action of the entire work. Robert McKee calls the call to action the inciting incident. Many other filmmakers and storytellers will call it the inciting incident. Insight, to start, to begin, to initiate. Incident, one particular moment in time. So it does need to be very specific. Your inciting incident needs to be very specific, one particular moment in which the actor is called into action. You can see why these terms are used interchangeably. Call to action and inciting incident. The thing to remember with both of these is whatever that moment is, it needs to be a moment. So you don't want to have a call to action that seems vague or seems to begin, in the living room, and then the character moves to the kitchen, and then they go out to work, and now they, are in their car driving, and you're saying that all these different moments are building your call to action. No. You want to find the specific moment. Is it when they're in the car that they are specifically called? Something happens, that they're specifically called to do something. They're specifically called to begin something, incite, to start something. It needs to be a particular moment that happens. It can come down to dialogue, a specific dialogue in which someone says, will you or won't you take this trip? In Star Wars, George Lucas developed one of the most classic and clearest understanding call to action. It is when Luke Skywalker is called to go with Obi-Wan. This is in the very first one because it's one of the clearest and most beautiful examples of classical 3-act structure in which we don't see it happening. We feel it in the story, and then when we look back on it, we see the principles at work. But Luke Skywalker is specifically called by Obi-Wan to come with him regarding this message to follow to find Princess Leia and save her. Help me, Obi-Wan, is the phrase that is used again and again. Now that's Obi-Wan's particular motivation, but then Luke Skywalker, after, help me, Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan says to Luke Skywalker, come with me. After that moment, your character has to decide yes or no. Your character may not decide yes or no right away, but the moment has to be specific. The moment in which they're asked, the moment in which they see the task in front of them, has to be one specific moment. After that, your character may decide in the instant, yes, I'll take it up. Or your character, like Luke Skywalker, may go home and talk to his family and have an entire interaction. Well, actually, he goes home and finds that his family, that there's something, tragic or unhappy, unpleasant has happened. So you want to, which oftentimes is what drives a character that initially is reluctant to go into that call to action. Usually something sad happens. So in our character arc, we're seeing sort of, you'll see in the document 3-act structure, there's a green line drawn at the top diagram. And that's because that's sort of, what it feels like as we're going through the act story. We're kind of at a status quo. We're learning the time, we're learning the space, setting. We're learning our character, their flaws, their strengths. We're learning we're reaching the call to action. Usually right after the call to action, there is a little dip because there is something that's sad that happens, something that unfortunate that happens. And it's usually that unfortunate event that then drives our character to say, yes, despite what reservations I have, I now have nothing to lose. Or I am at a point where saying no to this call to action means, unhappiness for myself. So they are now driven into accepting their call to action. When they accept their call to action, you have moved them from point A to point B. You have moved them in a dramatic act. We're now at the end of the act. Once we have a dramatic movement, we're at the end of the act. So the end of Act 1 is when the character says, yes, I will accept this call to action. For the purposes of making small videos that are easy to download, I'm going to pause here and then we'll continue with Act 2 and Act 3.